All right, like I mentioned, today we're doing something unique. I've never done something like this in my, 14 years of pastoring here. I'm doing more of a presentation-style sermon. That's why I'm here in the middle of the stage, and this actually helps some of our congregation who's watching online. And I would encourage you, maybe if some of you towards the back, you might like to sit a little closer, just because I know some of the details of the screen you might be able to see a little better. But you can move around if you're trying to get a good view of things. This is the week after Easter, right? And one of the beautiful things that happened on Easter Sunday morning was, of course, that the tomb was empty, right? The tomb was empty, the most beautiful thing. And what's interesting about this is that there was only one thing in the tomb, and it's what Luke and it's what John talk about. It was the burial cloth of Jesus. And in fact, this is a detail that's so important to the Gospels that all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all are at pains to describe Jesus being wrapped in this burial cloth. And then two of them are at pains to describe, right, that the cloth is still there after Jesus rises from the dead. So I've been very interested in this subject the last 12 years or so, studied it in depth, and I'm convinced that not only is there really theological significance to the story of the shroud in the four Gospels, but I believe that we may indeed, in fact I'm convinced we do, possess the actual historical artifact today, that Christians preserved it 2,000 years ago, and that it gives not only a testament to the empty tomb, but it gives a mighty witness to the actual crucifixion event. And even more than that, I believe it gives evidence to the resurrection event. So that's why I want to share this with you. I know some of you might have heard of this historical artifact before. It usually goes by the name the Shroud of Turin. It's because before that, it resided in France, in Chambéry. Before that, it resided in Liry, France. And then, as we'll see, I believe it resided before that in Constantinople, then in Edessa, Turkey, and ultimately, I believe, in Jerusalem. So I believe it's important, for the very least, for Christians to be aware that this historical artifact exists. Okay, I'm not saying you have to believe this is definitely the shroud Jesus was buried in, but I do think that after we look at this and we look at the details of this shroud, you'll walk away saying, okay, this is something I'm glad I was introduced to, and really, the details add up in an overwhelming way that it's hard to come up with another explanation other than this indeed is the burial cloth of Jesus. So I mentioned all four Gospels mention the shroud. Let's look at those verses. The first is the Gospel of Matthew, and this is after Jesus was crucified. Matthew 27:59 says, "And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud." Okay, we'll see all of them mention this linen shroud. Mark 15:46, "And Joseph," this is Joseph of Arimathea, "bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb." Luke 23:53, "Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb cut in stone, where no one had ever yet been laid." John 19:40-41, "So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid." So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all mention the linen shroud. This would have been the whole burial cloth that Jesus was wrapped in. And then John mentions linen cloths, plural. What he's talking about is there was also a head covering that went over the head of Jesus before they put the whole shroud over him. And there were also linen cloths that were tied over the full body shroud They were tied over his ankles, tied over his hands, tied over his heads to make sure that the body was set in place before rigor mortis set in. So that's what John's mention of cloths is. It's not like we think of someone who, dresses up as a mummy for Halloween and they wrap toilet paper all around them. That's not how Jesus was buried. He was buried in a full shroud, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about, and then bound with other linen strips of cloth. So then in the resurrection accounts, Luke and John both also speak about the shroud. Luke 24:12. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what he had happened. So before he just talked about the linen shroud, now he's talking about the linen cloth. So it would have been the shroud, the head covering, and the other linen cloths that held it together. John says this in John 20:5-8. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there. So this is the beloved disciple. This is John himself. He saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. So what's so fascinating about the burial accounts and the resurrection accounts is how at pain these writers are, right, to describe these cloths often. Not only do they say Peter saw the cloths, but then John went in and he saw the cloths, and that's the one thing that's mentioned. It's the one thing that they saw. Why is there so much detail about the cloths? Before we go to the next slide, I just want to mention here that it says that in John, in the burial account, it says that Jesus was buried as is the burial custom of the Jews. Some people will say that means that his body was washed before it was bound in the shroud. And that is true for a normal death, but Jesus' death was not a normal death. How many know that? And whenever there was post-mortem blood that flowed from a dead Jewish body, if over a cup of post-mortem blood flowed, the Jews considered that as lifeblood. And if there was that much lifeblood after the death of a body, they were not permitted to wash the body. So Jesus' body, we know, wouldn't have been washed according to the custom of the Jews, for that was their custom, but he would have been immediately bound in the shroud with all of his blood stains and blood markings on him. So this is what happens after John and Peter leave the tomb. In verse 11 and 12, it says, "But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain." So what's happening, right? The shroud of Jesus in all of its blood stains is right where he had lain, and then at the foot and the head of where he had lain are two angels. Here's an artistic rendition of it. I think it looks something like this, right? Mary sees these two angels. She's probably looking at the cloth right there below her, and then she turns to see Jesus, who at first she thinks is a gardener, but the moment Jesus says her name, Mary, she recognizes that he is indeed the risen Lord. But, looking at two angels at the top and the bottom of something, what would a Jewish person think of? The Ark of the Covenant. They would think of their most holy artifact, the Ark of the Covenant that had an angel at the top and of the bottom. And of course, what is poured in the middle of the Ark of the Covenant? The blood, right? The blood of the bull, the blood of the lamb, to take away the sins of the people. When Jesus was laid there in all of his blood, right, as our great high priest, what is he? He is the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. And this is what it signifies here. So here we see a rendition here of the shroud folded up with the bloodstains on it there in the garden tomb. When I was in Jerusalem a couple years ago, there's a few different traditional sites that you can go and visit. Here's one of the sites we visited. It's called the Garden Tomb. I'm not convinced this is where Jesus was buried, but It's at least possible. And I took this picture. What was cool, why I'm showing this picture is because you see that red light that's shining right there? You know, right where the body of the person would have lain? That's not natural light. In fact, I asked the person there, what's going on here? Why is this red light always there? And they're like, no. Well, it just kind of gave me revelation again of the fact that the blood of Jesus is poured over the middle of the mercy seat, right, for our eternal redemption. You know, when I was also in Israel, one thing we did is we went to the Israel Museum. And there's a lot of historical artifacts from Jesus' day. In fact, wherever you go in Israel, right, they're constantly, each and every year, discovering new things. And they had this awesome discovery in 1990. They discovered the ossuary of Caiaphas. Caiaphas, this is the high priest at the time of Jesus. Okay, the one who was the leader of the Sanhedrin, the one who wanted Jesus to be arrested, the one who prophesied that Jesus would die for the sake of the nation. And what an ossuary was after the body had decomposed in the grave, they would take out the bones and they would put the bones in an ossuary. And here we are. We have the historical artifact of the burial of Caiaphas the high priest. Not only that, but we have also in the Israel Museum there is the sarcophagus of King Herod. This is King Herod the Great. You know, there's 4 generations of King Herods in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. And this was the patriarch of the King Herods, right? He was the lead dude. He was the guy who killed all the babies in Bethlehem, wanted to kill Jesus. And we have the box that he was buried in, the sarcophagus. Okay, so 2 of the major leaders, we have testaments of their own burials. You know, in Egypt, you go to Egypt and we've discovered 2,000-year-old Egyptian shrouds. Here's just an example of one that had a painted image on the shroud, okay? So I just bring that up to show you that there are linen shrouds that can last thousands of years. So if Caiaphas has a historical artifact testifying to his historical death, if King Herod has a historical artifact testifying to his historical death, well, is it at least possible that Jesus would have a historical artifact that still testifies to his death? I think it is. You know why? Because God is not adverse to providential preservation. Why? Because our salvation is based in history. You know, when the old covenant was cut, right? What did God do? He told them to construct the Ark of the Covenant, and he told them to preserve 3 things in the ark. Anyone remember what they were? They were the manna in the wilderness, and they were to preserve it in a golden pot. And then what else? The tablets of the 10 commandments that God gave to Moses. What else? What was the 3rd thing? It was Aaron's rod that budded, that was showing to all of Israel that he indeed was the God-ordained and anointed high priest, and no other line could be it other than Aaron. So all 3 of these things gave testimony to the Old Covenant, and they had those artifacts with them until the ark was carried away by Babylon over 1,000 years later, okay? God providentially preserved these artifacts. Well, did God providentially preserve an artifact that testifies to the cutting of the new covenant? Has he providentially preserved for us the burial cloth, the shroud of Jesus? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's just some silly Catholic relic, right? And I understand that because there are a lot of silly Catholic relics in the world. A few things here. One, the Catholic Church has only owned the Shroud of Turin since 1985, meaning they've been in possession of it for only a generation. Before that, it was owned by private individuals. It was owned by other corners of the church. This is not something that's simply relegated to the Catholic Church. It's something that is the possession, really, of the Church Universal. But, you know, someone who brings out kind of the silliness of a lot of the relics in our day is Martin Luther. Martin Luther was someone who loved sarcasm, number one. He loved joking. He had a joyous heart about him, but he really brought out kind of the silliness a lot of the corrupted church in his own day, in the medieval period. This is something he wrote. He said, "What lies there are about relics. One claims to have a feather from the wing of the angel Gabriel, and the Bishop of Mainz has a flame from Moses' burning bush. And how does it happen that 18 apostles are buried in Germany when Christ had only 12? right? Good reason. There's good reason to be skeptical about a lot of supposed relics, okay? But that does not mean that there aren't true historical artifacts that have been preserved, right? And everything we need to look at, according to how does it stand up in its own regard, not just based on what some, religious authority says about it, but when it is stood up to the scrutiny of real investigation, historical, scientific investigation, how does it stand up to that investigation? So that's what we're going to do as we look through the subject of the Shroud of Turin. Now, a lot of people in the last generation who know anything about the Shroud of Turin, probably the only thing they know, if you just know about it superficially, is that it was debunked in 1988. In 1988, they did a carbon-14 dating test on it, okay? So if any of you know about carbon-14 dating test, it's very evasive, meaning whatever you date, it has to be burned up. So at first, no one really wanted to cut any part of the shroud off and burn it up because this is a really important artifact. But they decided to take a little square of the shroud, and they had 3 of these things sent to 3 different laboratories, all from the same little corner of the shroud. And it came back with a test that said it originated, the flax for the linen was harvested from between AD 1260 to 1390 with a 95% confidence rate. And all of the people who were skeptics of the shroud, they were just gleeful. They're like, yes, don't you see? This disproves the shroud. It clearly is a medieval forgery. In fact, all the major news outlets just were beaming with joy, spreading this news. The New York Times, the headline of the New York Times, fraud, right? The heading of the London's Evening Standard that night, the Shroud of Turin is fake. One of the top science journals, Nature Science Journal, came out a few months later with an article that said, the results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. So what we want to look at today is, was this responsible reporting? Or was this, poor news? Was it fake news? And we'll see, that's what I think it was. I think it was really irresponsible reporting. The man who was overseeing this test was the Oxford professor Edward Hall. And they had this big press conference after the results of the testing came back. And he had a big blackboard behind him with chalk written on it, 1260 to 1390, exclamation point. And he said it was a big load of rubbish, this medieval fakery. Or was it that? We'll see. So what is the Shroud of Turin? What is it? Well, it is 14 feet by 6 inches by 3 feet 9 inches. So it's a pretty long thing, right? From about podium to podium here, okay? And it would have wrapped around the whole body, front and back. Okay, so this is what it looks like. You see the faint image, right, of the body, front and back, imprinted on this cloth. And it is very light. It's like if you have your bed sheet, okay, it's the lightness of a bed sheet. But when we look at those measurements don't make a lot of sense, right? 14 feet 6 inches, 3 feet 9 inches. But when you convert it into the Assyrian cubit, which was the measurement that Jews used up until about a couple centuries after the time of Jesus, it is a perfect 8 cubits by 2 cubits. So it's cut according to first century Jewish measurements. Also, when you look at the weave, each of these things, they have very specific weaves. And the shroud's weave is a herringbone Z-twist 3-to-1 twill pattern. This, we're told by experts, is a rare and expensive weave. In fact, there are no known linens from the medieval period with this same weave. The closest existing comparable weave is a first century woolen cloth that was found in a Roman fort in Egypt. So no one that we know of in the medieval period was weaving linen cloths like this. The last person we know that did weave a cloth like this was from Egypt, the bordering country of Israel, in the first century. The shroud also has a stitch pattern alongside its 14-foot, 9-inch length, and it's 3 inches in And the stitch pattern also is very unique. In fact, in 1998, a textile expert testified that in her 40-year career, she had only observed a similar stitch pattern once. And that was in a cloth that also dated from the 1st century, and it was also not just near Israel, but it was in Israel, in Masada, just miles away from Jerusalem. The only other time she had ever seen a stitch pattern like this. Okay, so it's, what do we see? She says this, it's Dr. Fleury Lemberg, okay, this textile expert, and she says tapestries during the 14th and 15th centuries, when the carbon dating people said the shroud was faked up, the tapestries during those centuries were very small, only between 3 and 6 feet high, right? We have the tapestries that existed in that time. If you find linen bed sheets from that time, which is rare, you will find a seam in the middle of the sheets. 2 loom pieces will have been sewn together at their selvages to make them wide enough for the bed. But of course, the shroud doesn't have this. So how could it be from, 14th or 15th century Europe? So the weave, the stitch, and the size of the shroud all indicate 1st century Jewish linen cloth. If a forger concocted the shroud in the 14th century, they spared no expense getting the most minute details correct about simply the canvas they would use to then fake up this supposed relic of Jesus. So another thing we want to consider about this, all Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention, right, it is a linen shroud. John mentions it's linen cloths, right? What does that mean? It means there's nothing else in it, like wool, etc., right? What could Jewish people not do? They could not mix, right, wool and linen and everything else. That wouldn't be kosher. So Italian historian, and that's what this shroud is. It is a purely linen cloth. The Italian historian Maria Luisa Regato believes the exceptional Z-twist of the threads and remarkable quality taken from the cloth suggests this piece of linen would have been taken from the temple's reserves, from a roll intended to make the garment of a high priest. For instance, we're told in Leviticus 16:4 that the high priest's garment was specifically made of pure linen. Instead of buying it in town when the shops were probably closed, I think it's Matthew who tells us that Joseph of Arimathea went out and bought the shroud. Joseph would have purchased it from the temple depot to which he had access as a member of the Sanhedrin. So her idea is this, it's Passover. All the shops are closed on Passover as Jesus has died. The only access Joseph of Arimathea would have had to get a cloth like this was actually from the temple reserves. And that he went in there and he would have got one of the cloths that would have been used to possibly even dress the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Hebrews 7:27-28 says this, "Such a high priest was fitting for us, who does not need daily as those high priests to offer up sacrifices, for he did once for all when he offered up himself." Amen. So Jesus was laid in a tomb out of hewn rock with a large stone rolled over the entrance. We know the temple, according to 1 Kings 5, was also made of hewn stones that were large. We have already seen that 2 angels were exactly where his head and where his feet were laying, signifying the Ark of the Covenant. So it's like the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. And what is Jesus? Jesus is laid to rest in the tomb and right there, and it is a picture of his finished work, a picture of the one sacrifice to rid us of all sacrifices. Dressed in a linen garment like the high priest, he offered himself as a perfectly sufficient sacrifice. So when did this shroud begin to get a lot of notice? Well, no historian debates, that the shroud existed in 1355 in Liry, France. Everyone agrees it at least goes back that far, And how do we know that? Well, we have many, many historical documents that testify to the shroud being shown in the Church of St. Mary in Liry, France. Not only that, but we even have medallions that were created and had been dated to 1355 at that time that show the shroud with the front of the body and back of the body on the medallion, as well as the two coat of arms of the owners of the shroud at that time, Geoff de Charny and his wife. And this is kind of what displays would look like in the Church of St. Mary's in Leary and other places at the time. You know, of course, all the church officials of that day, this is before the Reformation of the 16th century, so they're all Roman Catholics here in Europe, and they're all wearing the vestments, of course, of the Catholics, and they're holding up the shroud at these large displays that people would come to see. And as we see in this painting, this is before there were burn marks on the shroud. You know, in 1532, the shroud went through a fire. It almost was incinerated, but it was providentially preserved, but it still has some diamond-shaped burn marks from that event. So as you can see, there are the diamond-shaped burn marks. There's a picture of a close-up of the face. Okay, this is what you see when you're looking at the Shroud of Turin. You see this face here, right? And then if you look at the full 14 feet of it, you see the full body, front body, and the full back of the body. And as you can see there, you can see all the different scourge wounds, right? You can see all the scourge wounds in the head. You can see the bigger wound on the left wrist here as he's crossing over his right hand. You can see the big wounds in his ankles. We'll get to a lot of these details more. You can even see the chest wound on the left side of his chest, very large, right, bloody fluid there. So, what happened before Leary? Is there a case that we have historical record of the Shroud of Turin before Leary, France? I think there's a very strong record that goes all the way back, not just to the 4th century, but all the way back to Jerusalem in 33 AD. And where its longest stay was in the early centuries was in a city called Edessa, Turkey. Edessa, Turkey was not far from Jerusalem. It was on the far east side of Turkey, just north of Jerusalem. And there was a tradition that developed in the early church. One of the first church historians was a guy by the name of Eusebius in the 4th century. And Eusebius tells this story about King Agbar of Edessa, how he sent a letter to Jesus asking for Jesus to come to see him. And according to this tradition, Jesus didn't come to see him, but sent King Agbar a letter and sent him a gift. Now, I don't think Jesus sent King Agbar a letter, and I don't think they sent him a gift, but the Edessans were in possession of a precious artifact that had the configuration of a body on it, and they were trying to explain how they came in possession of this. So I believe they invented this story of Jesus sending a letter. But this is what one of the renditions of the letter from the 8th century says. It says this. You know, it says, "If you wish to see my face in the flesh, behold, I send you a linen on which you will discover not only the features of my face, but a divinely copied configuration of my entire body." Okay? So this image of Edessa, the Mandelion that they sometimes call it, it not only was a face, right, but it was a picture of the entire body. So one of the early church historians, Evagrius, he was an eyewitness of this image of Edessa, the Shroud of Turin, I believe, in the 6th century. And in 544, the Persians were coming from the east, and they were attacking Edessa. And they were going up the siege ramps, ready to just absolutely tear down the walls of Edessa. And so what do the Edessans do? This is what Evagrius says. He says, he was there as an eyewitness. He says, the Edessans brought the divinely created image, which human hands had not made, the one that Christ the God sent to Abgar when he yearned to see him. And he says after this, what happened after they brought out this image is that the siege works, the ramp that they built, that it collapsed. And they attributed it partly to bringing this image out. And the Edessans were saved at that time. They were spared. And so what happens is, at this moment, this image explodes in popularity. Everyone wants to know more about this image of Edessa. And so the entire artwork of the entire Christian world, it changes in the 6th century. Okay, so why do we always see a Jesus figure or image always the same? Well, you know what it's actually based off of? It's based off of the Shroud of Turin. That's why all the Jesus images look at least similar. So, you know, there was a council. It was the Seventh Ecumenical Council in the early churches called Nicaea II. And at this council, they read a sermon that was attributed to a church father named Athanasius from the 4th century. He was an important figure who really defended the deity of Jesus Christ. And from this sermon, this is what they state. They say that Athanasius said that in the year AD 68, an image of our Lord and Savior at full length was taken from Jerusalem and moved to Syria, specifically to Antioch. Now, why 68 AD? Anyone remember what happened in AD 70? The destruction of Jerusalem. What happened a few years before that? All the Christians in Jerusalem, they fled Jerusalem to the city of Pella and they were saved. They fled to the mountains just as Jesus said in Matthew 24 to do, and they were saved. Well, Athanasius tells us that they carried with them this precious historic artifact, which was the image of our Lord and Savior at full length, which I believe was his burial cloth. Now, at this time, you know, in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, this image of Edessa becomes known as akeiropoietas, one word which means the image made without hands. It was known as, we've seen, the divinely created image. They knew it was not a work of an artist. They believed it was a supernatural image. At that time, they weren't sure how it was created, but they believed they were in possession of this supernatural image of Jesus. And there were a lot of different ideas of maybe how that image came to be. We'll see that I believe have a lot more clarity of how that image came to be today. So what happened is all the artistic depictions now, because they believe this is a divinely created image, whenever they're creating images of Jesus, they want to follow this divinely created image as close as possible. They think it's a divinely given blueprint. And so we'll see that the artwork began to follow this. Now, this was a widespread idea that the church possessed linen cloths with the full body image of Jesus on it. In fact, in the church gatherings, for instance, in Spain, one of the Spanish liturgies, the Mozarabic rite, this is what they said the week before Easter. They read, Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw, or the first Saturday after Easter, Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints, vestigia, of the dead and risen man on the linens. So here in the 6th century, we possess records, right, of what they read in their churches, and they're saying that Peter and John saw the full body-length image of Jesus on the linens that they saw. Christians are saying, right, from a long time ago, they're all confessing that yes, there are these full body images on the burial cloths of Jesus. In the 6th or 7th century, we're told that the image of Edessa, which I believe is the Shroud of Turin, they coined a term, a new Greek term, to describe how it was folded. So they created this term called tetradiplon. It's the first time we see this term in history, and it simply means doubled in four, for how they would preserve the cloth. And you know what happens when you double in four the Shroud of Turin? What happens is you just are left with the face of the man of the shroud. And this was a way they could display, instead of 14 feet, right, just display the most important part of the shroud would be by holding up the face. So if it was doubled in four, the image of Edessa couldn't have been some small image, right? It had to have been a large image, because once you double it in four, it's going to be quite a bit smaller. There's a man named Paul Vignon. He was a French professor of biology and an artist, and he discovered 20 unique features of the shroud that are found in the depictions of Christ from the 6th century onwards. And so what would happen is all the artists, they would slavishly copy, and that's why you constantly see about 20 unique features. For instance, we have this famous picture of Jesus from the 6th century called Christ's Pantocrator. It was discovered 50 years ago in the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai. And we see it very closely mirrors the Shroud of Turin, having at least 11 of the 15 Vignon markings. we see that coins were minted in the 7th century from Justinian II, and they really slavishly copied on these mintings what looks like the Shroud of Turin. Look at this coin here. And this historian, he records, Professor Giulio Fanti, he records 12 things that are similar between the shroud here and this 7th century Justinian II coin. In fact, look at this 10th century coin, Byzantine coin. And just look how it slavishly copies the hair on the left side, right? I don't even know if it thinks it's hair, but you have the 2 different hair markings. You have the cross shape on the middle of the forehead. You have the owlish eyes. You have the swelling in the cheeks. It's remarkable how close these coins are to the Shroud of Turin. Why do they mirror the Shroud of Turin if the Shroud of Turin was a forgery from the 14th century? You know, before the image of Edessa became wide known because of what happened in 6th century, you know, all of the paintings of Jesus, they looked really different. In fact, they looked like a Roman. Here's a lot of the frescoes from the catacombs of the early church. And look at Jesus depicted here as the Good Shepherd. And what do we see? We see a clean-shaven man who's kind of scrawny, who's, you know, got a Roman haircut. It looks nothing like all of the images of Jesus you see from the 6th century forward. Why? Because that's the time that the image of Jesus became more widespread. So what happens after it was in Edessa? Well, after a 400-year stay in Edessa, it was moved to Constantinople in 944. In fact, there was an army that came from Constantinople, and they said, at this time Edessa is ruled by Muslims, and they said, we're going to destroy you unless you give us the image of Edessa. They know this is the most holy artifact in the entire world. And that's all they want. They said, we'll destroy you except you get, and the Muslims, they know how important this image is. So they actually have to think about it for a second. Should we put up a fight? Finally, they lay down their arms. They give it to the Constantinopolitans. They march it several hundred miles back over to Constantinople, and they march it into their glorious cathedral in that city. Constantinople was the greatest city of that day. It was like the New York, right, of the USA. It was where everything happened. It was where all culture was preserved. And it hung there for the next 260 years. In fact, there's a feast day in the Eastern Orthodox Church celebrates about the arrival of the Mandylion there in Constantinople. Now, what happens while it's there in Constantinople? Well, there is a very, very, very strong case that a Hungarian artist came and copied this artifact. In fact, the oldest codex we have in the Hungarian language is something called the Hungarian Prayer-Codex. And in this Prayer-Codex, there's 4 images, and there's description of these images in the Hungarian language. And what we see is a very precise artistic rendition of the shroud. So what's interesting, of course, is this is the 11th century. It's several decades before the earliest year that the carbon dating said the shroud could have existed. We see 9 common characteristics. We see the herringbone weave. We see a beard and long hair. We see the body is naked. We see the right hand rested over the left. We see nail wounds on the wrist. We see the fingers are long. There are no thumbs are showing, only 4 fingers. We see a mark above the right eye that corresponded to the reverse 3-shaped bloodstain on the shroud. And most importantly, there was an L-shaped pattern of holes on the cloth. For many scholars, this is definitive proof the shroud existed before the earliest date given by the 1988 radiocarbon test, at least 70 years earlier. Look at how he copies the L-shaped holes. We don't know how these poker holes got on the Shroud of Turin, but at some point, you know, they got there. And here he is copying these L-shaped holes and copying to a precision the stitch pattern on the back and the front of the shroud. He's not copying anything other than the Shroud of Turin. Well, what happens after it's staying in Constantinople? The last time we hear of it is in 1204, and a pilgrim is in Constantinople, and he talks about the shroud that's hanging up there in that great cathedral. This is what he says in his journal. He says he was in a church where was kept the St. Ones in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood up straight every Friday so that the features of our Lord could be plainly seen there. So this was displayed every Friday for pilgrims. They'd come and they would see it. Well, what happens? In 1204, Constantinople is sacked by the Knights Templar. So the most likely thing that happens is that the Knights Templar, they gain possession of the Shroud of Turin, of the Mandilion of Edessa. How do we know that? Well, the best reason given is in 1287, we have an archived testimony of a young French Templar, and we're told he was taken in a secret room where he was shown a long linen cloth on which was impressed the figure of a man, and was told to kiss the feet of the image 3 times. In 1307, the King of France arrested the Templar leaders in his realm, charging them of worshiping a mysterious idol in the form of the head of a man with a long reddish beard. So that would have been the bloodstains, of course, on the shroud, which are pretty bright red. So what happens after that? Well, in 1314, the King of France, he burns the master of Normandy, the Templar master of Normandy, at the stake. And this is when the shroud pops up a generation later. And guess what? Who's the owner of it? A guy by the same exact name, Geoffrey de Charny. And historians, in particular Ian Wilson, he says that enough has been learned about both individuals during the last 3 decades to make the family connection near definite. So it seems that this master of Normandy bequeathed the shroud before he was burned at the stake to his relative, and that's when it began to have its public showings in Liry, France in 1354. So here is kind of the journey of the shroud. It begins in Jerusalem, of course, in the tomb, 33 AD. Athanasius says in 68 AD, it's taken to Antioch. And so sometime in between that, it's taken to Edessa, where it stays until 944. Then it's taken to Constantinople. After that, the Knights Templar are in possession of it for about 110 years, most likely the Knights Templar. Then it ends up in Liry, France, down to Chambéry, France, and finally in Turin, France, where it still resides today. How about scientific evidence? So we've seen sort of the probable and reasonable provenance for the shroud. Is there scientific evidence? Are there clues scientifically that show us something different than what the 1988 carbon dating gave us? Well, enter 1898, crucial year. In this year, the shroud was shown publicly for the first time in 34 years in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Italian Constitution. And last second, they said, you know what? We want to take a photograph of this. So they secure an amateur photographer by the name of Secondo Pia. And he takes some photographs of the shroud before it's displayed before everyone. And he's in the dark room, right? He's in the back dark room. And he's expecting to see the images of the shroud that he takes. He's expecting to see kind of like the blurry negatives you would for any picture, right? Not something really fancy at all. But what he sees, when he sees the developed negatives, he is in such shock, he almost drops the plates. Like he has chills that go down his spine. Why? Because this is what he saw once the negatives developed. We see there, right on the left, what you see with the naked eye. When you take a picture and the negative is developed, you see a perfect picture, and that is what you see on the right. So here you have a perfect photographic negative on a non-sensitive ancient linen cloth. What's going on here? And of course, he took the full body images. That was the 1898 full body images that Secondo Pia took. And obviously, this was a jaw-dropping moment. And a lot of people didn't believe him, right? Of course not. But they didn't allow him to take more pictures to verify what he said was true, right? So they had to wait 33 more years to the next public showing. And this time, they got a professional photographer. They had 5 more professional photographers there to verify that no one was doing anything, silly, doctoring the plates or something like that. And after the 2.5 minutes it took to develop, Secundo P was also there, and he shouted in vindication, "It is the same." And at that moment, people began to take it even more seriously. In fact, one of the biggest intellectuals in all of Europe was a doctor by the name of Dr. Pierre Barbeau. He was the president of the prestigious Paris Society of Surgeons. He was so interested in the shroud that he wrote an entire book on it called Doctor at Calvary. And because he, had access to many medical things, being the president of this society, he could get a lot of dead cadavers, and he could do a lot of experiments. So he begins experimenting with different crucifixion postures. He crucifies people through their palms. And you know what happens when he does that? The weight of the body makes the nail tear through the hand, and the body just falls off. So you can't be crucified through the palm. Well, then he says, you know what, there's this thing called the destot space in your wrist. And if you're crucified there and you did that with a cadaver, guess what? You're held up. Well, what do we see on the Shroud of Turin? Where is the nail wound? It's in the wrist. You know, according to the Gospels, right, Jesus was crucified in the hands, but the Greek word for hand, you know what it included? Anything from the top of the fingertips to the elbow. This is the biblical word for hand. Just like the biblical word for feet is anywhere from the foot up to the ankle. That is the biblical word for foot. So what's interesting is that every artistic depiction up until the 17th century, you know where it shows Jesus crucified? In the palm. The only thing prior to the 17th century that shows Jesus crucified with a nail anywhere other than the palm, you know what it was? The Shroud of Turin, showing that he's crucified in the wrist. How would a 14th century forger know not to have thumbs as part of their forgery? So the other thing Dr. Pierre Barbeau noticed is when he nailed in the destot space in the wrist, is he hits a nerve and the thumb snaps behind the hand. Okay? So that's why on the shroud you see 4 fingers but no thumbs, because of this anatomical feature. How would they go against all the artistic conventions of those days that were before them? Did they know a nail would hit a nerve in the wrist that would cause the thumbs to snap behind the palms? The greatest doctors in the world were not aware of that until the 20th century. The Bible tells us Jesus was scourged, but it gives no details. Well, the shroud shows 372 scourge wounds. By his stripes we are healed. You know, the wounds, interestingly, match the exact dumbbell shape of a Roman flagrum. You know, the medieval church was not in possession of Roman instruments of torture. They didn't have any. It wasn't until 1709, the 18th century, that the sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum were excavated. Okay, remember when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the 1st century and it buried the city of Pompeii with ash? Well, it also buried the city of Herculaneum. And in that ash, guess what was preserved? A lot of different things, including a 1st century Roman flagrum. And you know, as they're looking at this Roman flagrum they unearthed in 1709, and they look at the dumbbell, the 3 dumbbells at the end of the flagrum, they say, wait a second, haven't we seen something like this? Yes, it matches exactly the dumbbell shapes of the scourge wounds on the Shroud of Turin that had been displayed for centuries and centuries. What does this testify to? The fact that Jesus was whipped with over 124 lashes, over 3 times the amount that were allowed by the Old Testament. Why? Because Jesus wasn't crucified by the Jews, he was crucified by the Romans, and they could care less about keeping that Jewish law. Now, Dr. Antonacci, he says, photographic enlargement, microscopic examination, and ultraviolet lighting show that the skin was torn open and that clot formation and retraction occurred at these sites. These wounds are signs of a savage scourging, probably by 2 separate individuals. In fact, the directionality of the scourge wounds on the shroud show us the 2 different angles from which he would have been scourged. Psalm 129:3 says, the plowers plowed my back, they made their furrows long, almost like a prophetic declaration of Christ. Andrew Dalton says, each one of these marks is the damage of a 3rd-degree burn. Christ was made one large stripe or bruise for our sin. After all of these 124 lashes were on him, he would have been unrecognizable, fully covered with blood. Near the chest wound, the shroud contains an immense amount of real blood and pericardial fluid. This wound is the exact size of an unearthed Roman lance. They didn't have Roman instruments of torture, including the lance. But when they unearthed it, you know what they saw? The size of the end of the lance is the exact centimeter measurements that is on the shroud. And it's in the exact anatomically perfect place between the 5th and 6th ribs that would strike the heart of Christ. You know, another thing about this wound is that all the other wounds, 124 lashes, 372 wounds, all of them, they have invisible serum halos around them. You know why? Because invisible serum halos develop if the body is still living. But you know what doesn't happen is post-mortem wounds, they do not have invisible serum halos. And these invisible serum halos are seen by ultraviolet light. Well, when you look at the side wound under ultraviolet light, you know what you don't see? You don't see an invisible blood serum halo. Why? Anyone know why? Because that was the one wound that was post-mortem. After Christ has died, that's when the centurion struck the side of Christ and blood and water poured forth. How did the 14th century forger know to put invisible blood serum halos that weren't discovered until the late 20th century, and to not have the invisible blood serum halo on the side wound? Okay. The shroud shows abrasions across the shoulder blades, possibly a dislocation of the right shoulder. You know, when Jesus carried the cross, it would have been a large wound, about 30 to 125 pounds across his shoulders. And remember, he can barely move after being scourged so badly. In fact, he doesn't make it all the way to Calvary, right? They have to commandeer Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross for him. And, you know, most likely it's because he dislocated his shoulder, and you can't carry anything with a dislocated shoulder. He probably fell face first into the ground, which we'll see later. So he's got swelling, vicious welts. You know, there's a 3D image, which we'll see in a moment. In the 3D image, they show just the absolute swelling in his cheekbones. It shows that the cartilage in his nose is bruised. It shows that parts of his beard are plucked out. We look at the head wounds. We see a crown of thorns. There's 30 wounds on the shroud in the head. You know, these were sharp Jerusalem spikes. It says in Matthew 27, when they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. They spat on him, and they took the reed and struck him on the head, pounding those thorns into his head. What does this show us? Well, it's the prophecy of Genesis 22 being fulfilled. Genesis 22, Abraham sees a substitute ram for his son Isaac, so he doesn't have to sacrifice Isaac. Remember that? And Genesis 22:13 says that Abraham lifted up his eyes, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. The ram was caught, right, on its head with a crown of thorns. Jesus, our substitute sacrifice, was on Mount Moriah, right there in the Praetorium on the Temple Mount, the same place this ram was 2,000 years earlier. That's where Jesus is. And what is pounded into his head? The same thing that was in the ram's head, a crown of thorns. This wasn't like some nice little crown. This was like an Eastern crown, a bush, a cap, and it was absolutely pounded into his head. Why? Because he took the curse that you and I deserved. In 1973, there was a one-day examination, and one of the men who was permitted to have an examination was Max Frey, who was a Swiss pathologist who was also an evangelical Christian. You know, a lot of the people who study the shroud are evangelical Christians. It's, like I said, this is not a Catholic thing, okay? And what he did, he took 12 sticky tape samples, and he wanted to collect any pollen grains that were on top of the shroud. And you know what he discovered? He discovered that there were at least 58 different species of plant pollen from his sticky tapes. And you know what you can do? Is he went around the world and collected samples of pollen, because we didn't have a big collection back in the 1970s. So he's doing some of his own work. And he finds that the majority of these pollens are from the regions that were unexpected. At least from people who believed in the forgery. Yeah, there were a few pollens from Liry, France, a few pollens from Chambry, a few pollens from Turin, like we would expect. But you know where the bulk of them were from? Edessa, Turkey. Jerusalem. In fact, 3 of the poems were specific to Edessa, meaning those poems only exist in Edessa, and 13 of the poems were specific and unique to Jerusalem and northern Judea. In fact, some of these poems had been extinct from the 2nd century. So did this forger from the 14th century find extinct pollen grains from 2nd century Jerusalem and position them on the shroud for his forgery? I don't think so. In 1976, there was a professor from the U.S. Air Force Academy and a scientist at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, and he took a photograph of the shroud and he put it under a VP8 analyzer. You know what came out? A 3D image. You know what they were able to show? That this is not just a perfect photographic image, but it's a hologram. And because of that, 3 different statues have been created of what the man of the shroud would look like. Here we see he's about a 5'10", he's about 175 pounds. Blood testing has shown he's got AB blood. I say that because those are all my measurements too, 5'10", 175. I got AB blood, so it's easy for me to remember. You know, 5 years after Max Fry, there was another investigation done. This was the biggest investigation ever done on the shroud. Scientists were given 5 days, 120 continuous hours to investigate with as many scientific studies as they could, and it was headed by the guy who was from the Air Force Weapons Laboratory. And they had 33 expert scientists from all different disciplines. They loaded up, 80 crates, 16,000 pounds of scientific equipment. They flew to Turin, Italy, and they conducted as many experiments. And then 3 years later, after mulling over these experiments, they wrote up this report. It says this: no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils. It ends like this: there are no chemical or physical methods known which can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. Thus, the answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now, as it has in the past, a mystery. We conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human from a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. Now, most of these scientists were atheists, they were agnostics, they were Jews, they were not Christians. And this is what they're saying. Okay, here's a 64 times magnification of the shroud, showing the image. You know, the image is just sort of the decoloration of a yellow-brown on the top fibers. Each thread is 20 flaxen fibers, and it's only the top 2 or 3, like invisibly thin image that creates this image. There's no directionality to the image, meaning it isn't the work of an artist. The chemist on the STURP team said this: it is as if every pore and every hair of the body contained a micro-miniature laser. Wonder what could create that. We'll see. A professional photographer said this: I've been involved in the invention of many complicated visual processes, and I can tell you that no one could have faked that image. No one could do it today with the technology we have. All of the multi-million and billion-dollar laboratories around the world, none of them can produce a duplicate of the shroud. It is unduplicable. There are offers of $1 million out there for anyone who can simply duplicate this image on another linen cloth, and no one can do it, even though supposedly this 14th century man did it. The blood on the shroud, around every scourge wound are blood serum halus. We already went over that. It's AB blood. Look at this. The blood, there's a difference between the blood in your veins and the blood in your arteries, okay? And you know what they show from the blood on the shroud? That the venous blood is exactly where the venous blood is supposed to be, and the arterial blood is exactly where the arterial blood is supposed to be. Knowledge of the difference between venous and arterial blood was not discovered until 1593, centuries after it began to be displayed in Liry, France. Did a forger in the 14th century know the difference between venous and arterial blood and put it exactly where it's supposed to be on the shroud, even though 200 years later it's first discovered? I don't think so. The blood on the shroud also contains a high content of bilirubin, which is found, you know what, is produced in the liver when the body undergoes traumatic shock, meaning this is not the blood of a normal human. None of us would have the content of bilirubin that is on the shroud. Our blood couldn't be used for the shroud. Only the blood of a severely traumatized man could have been used on the shroud because of the content of bilirubin. I think crucifixion qualifies. John 27 says this, the face cloth which has been on Jesus' head. You know, in Oviedo, Spain, they say that they have the face cloth, and I think there's a good case they do. Now, no historian really debates that the face cloth goes back to the 7th century at least. And when you superimpose this face cloth over the shroud, guess what happens? You have a perfect match. It's the same blood type on the face shroud as on the face cloth, AB. The nose measures at the same length. There's an inverse 3 on both of them. There's 120 points of congruence. In 2012, they did a testing on the limestone on the face cloth, and you know what came back? That 75% of the limestone came from the same limestone shelf of the limestone in Jerusalem, where the Holy Sepulchre, Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb is. Well, it was also the same limestone on the shroud. So, you know, the STURP chemists, they discover this limestone. One of them says, it's dirt. There's dirt on there. You know, looking through their microscope, these are just microscopic like specks, just like the pollen. And they see this dirt, and they say, oh, we can study this dirt, and we can see where it's from. So they get, you know, all these samples. And they see it's not only on the feet, but it's on the knees, the nose, and the eye. Remember when Jesus fell face planted probably after he dislocated his shoulder, it would have got on the nose and the forehead and on the knees. And so they say, let's get some samples from Israel. They get 9 different samples, and it doesn't match anything. Then finally, they're able to obtain a sample from the limestone shelf in Jerusalem. And guess what? It's a perfect match. It's a perfect match. It is covered in dirt of Jerusalem. And it is under the bloodstains, which is under the image, meaning that limestone had to be there from the very beginning. The blood was there, meaning it was there hundreds and hundreds or 2,000 years ago, okay? Someone just didn't say, oh, this would be a nice kind of thing to put in today, and, you know, we could fake people out. No, it's under the blood. In coins over the eyes. You know, on dead people in that day, they would sometimes put coins over the eyes after they close the eyelids, and they put coins on top. Well, the 3D imaging and some of the 1931 photographs, people began to see over the eyes, there were coin images. And so in 1977, it becomes even more pronounced with the 3D imagery. And so in 1979, they go to a coin expert named Michael Marks, who's an expert in Greek classical coins. And you know what he says the coin is? It's the size, shape, and lettering of the coin matched a coin minted by Pontius Pilate between 29 to 32 AD in Jerusalem. In fact, the 31 AD minted coin by Pontius Pilate, those are the coins over the eyes on the shroud. Here are some of those images of the zoom-ins of those coins. So the thing is, when they first discovered, they saw the letters UCAI on the coin. And people were like, no, that can't be the coin because it's UKAI. And so they say clearly, haha, this is a forgery. They got one of the letters wrong. And then one of these classical coin experts says, no, there actually was one press of the coin that got the lettering wrong, and we still possess 4 of those coins today, UCAI. So, you know, there's all sorts of people. This guy shows 74 points of congruence between the coins and the pilots. There's flower markings on the shroud. This guy found 28 different species of plants on the shroud. That's images are imprinted on the shroud. And you know where all these 28 flowers grow? Jerusalem. They all grow in Jerusalem. And so the guy who found these flower images, he goes to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he consults with the professor of botany there. And now he confirms. He's a Jew. He's not a believer in Jesus. He confirms, yep, these are all flora from Jerusalem. And then they compare it to Max Frey's pollen studies. And they say, yeah, he found 25 of the pollens of these 28 flower images. Here they are. They all match. And how about this? There's a distribution map of the only place on earth where 3 of the flower images on the shroud are found growing together. There's only one place on earth where all these flowers grow together. You know where it is? Jerusalem. But they're all on the shroud. No one knew this until they studied it in the 1990s in depth. There's one specific flower image on the shroud that, you know how certain flowers, they open certain amounts during the day? Well, that's this flower. And the way by the amount it's open, they know when it's picked, because then it stays open that much once it's picked. And they know it was picked at 3 p.m. What happened at 3 p.m.? Jesus died. They began to take the body down and pick the flowers for his burial. And then we know how much the flowers are wilted. The experts say it looks like they've been wilted anywhere between 24 to 36 hours. What happened 24 to 36 hours after Jesus died? Early Sunday morning, resurrection. Was there an event that happened early Sunday morning that could possibly have caused the flowers, coins, blood, and body image to be imprinted on the shroud? Yes, there was. This gets into image formation theories. Some people says it's a forger, right? We've shown how that's pretty much impossible. Some people say it's just a natural formation. No one really believes that. Others say it was a supernatural thing, in particular, light burst from a dead body. Now, I think that is not just probable, but we know that's possible because it has happened in the person of Jesus Christ, right? So people who don't believe in Jesus, they dismiss that. But hey, that really happened, so maybe this is what caused the image. In 1930s, P.W. Gorman proposed a flash of heat and light theory. And he said that the resurrection was some sort of light phenomena that preserved an imprint of the body on the shroud. If true, the shroud would not simply be a testimony of the passion, but also a testimony to the resurrection. In 1966, Geoffrey Ash wrote, "The physical change of the body at the resurrection may have released a brief and violent burst of some radiation other than heat, perhaps scientifically identifiable, perhaps not, which scorched the cloth. In this case, the shroud is a quasi-photograph of Christ returning to life, produced by a kind of radiance or incandescence partially analogous to heat and its effects." So, in other words, as Christ came back from the realm of the dead with a burst of new creation light, he takes a selfie, right? He says, this is the most important moment in history, and we're not going to forget about it. I'm going to take a picture of it. I'm going to take a picture of the fact that your redemption stands complete. Now, like I said, no laboratory in the world can produce this. But what some scientists have done is they've replicated on a very small scale, like the size of a pea, not 14 feet by 3 feet, but at the size of the pea, that a brief flash of high-intensity ultraviolet radiation can create rapid dehydration and create this yellowish image. But for ultraviolet light to be able to create such a large image, one would need the equivalent of 500,000 searchlights worth of energy emanating from the body for 1/40 billionth of a second. If the physicists are correct with their data, to create the image of the shroud would take more than the electrical output of the entire world at any given moment. We know what happens in quasars, neutron star collisions, magnetars. There is no natural event in the cosmos that produces an ultraviolet blast of light for 3 to 4 nanoseconds at 1 billion watts. Meaning, once again, this is unduplicable. Was the resurrection the greatest light burst in history? Was this the let there be light moment of the new creation, right? Paul says that I may know him in the power of the resurrection. This was a very powerful event. You know, others say that the image could have been formed through the radiation light burst of the resurrection event. The neutrons and the electrons would have gone through the cloth, but the protons would have been embedded, which created this image and created, in fact, the 3D effects. This investigator says, after more than a century of trying to replicate the shroud using human technology, the only hypothesis that can account for what we see on the shroud is something science cannot explain: radiation from a dead body. So what about this supposed carbon dating test? Well, it's been debunked many, many times. You know, the very day after it was released, scientists began asking for the raw data of the tests in 1889. Every single time anyone who requested the raw data, you know what happened? They were turned down. It took them begging for 35 years, 30 years, until 2017, 29 years. And it took a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, for them to finally release the raw data of this carbon dating test in 1988. And you know what it proved? It proved they're all a bunch of frauds. And, well, we'll see. You know, the professor who was at the Professor Hall from Oxford, when he was asked about, well, how was it created if it's from the medieval period? He says there was a multi-million-pound business in making forgeries during the 14th century. Someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it. Does that sound like what we've just looked at concerning the shroud? Just a bit of linen, you know, expert first century weaves, you know, and they just flogged someone and they flogged the shroud. No, of course not. This guy's not a serious scientist. It's not an unreasonable, undetached scientific explanation. So what we know is that ultimately what happened was they took a sample that was corrupted from the corner of the shroud from a raised sample in 1973, and we have a sample of the cloth from the same site that the sample for the carbon-14 tests were taken from, and we know that this was sewn in an invisible French weave in the 17th century, and it is not original to the cloth. Okay? In fact, there's cotton found in it. There's madder root incrustation for dye. There's a lot of things that are not consistent with the rest of the shroud. So this guy wrote an 800-page book just on the C14 test, if you really want to know about it. It's been debunked thoroughly. This is a picture of the ultraviolet light of where the carbon-14 test samples were taken from. You see how the coloration's different in that corner? It's because it's not original to the shroud. So Ray Rogers, at first, he was not convinced that this was, not part of the original crowd, but after thorough study, he became convinced. He saw the presence of cotton, incrustation from madder root, specific spliced fibers, and vanillin, all of which were not representative of the rest of the shroud. So he published his peer-reviewed findings in Thermochemica Acta. He wrote, pyrolysis mass spectrometry results from the sample area coupled with microscopic and microchemical observations proved that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. Okay, how about other tests? There's been other dating tests besides carbon-14, and guess what? They all date, when? They all date to the 1st century. 5 of them, okay? The average, in fact, this guy in 2014, Professor Giulio Fanti from the University of Padua, he did 3 separate dating methods, and they all established an average age of 33 BC plus or minus 250 years for the shroud. That includes the vanillin test, the Fourier transformed infrared spectrometry, the Raman-Leisen spectroscopy test, mechanical tension and comprehensibility test. There was also a vanillin test. This guy, in 2022, just a couple years ago, he did a wide-angle X-ray scattering test, and it dated the shroud to AD 55 to 74 AD, plus or minus 100 years, with a 95% confidence rate. Why don't we take every other dating test that dates to the 1st century and just throw the bad 1988 carbon dating test out, right? It just is ridiculous. Well, one reason why is because the media doesn't want to have to deal with that, okay? Because a lot of the media just doesn't like Jesus very much. Okay. I mentioned this. There is a $1 million challenge to replicate the Shroud of Turin. The producer of the documentary Silent Witness and Who Can He Be, David Rolfe, is offering $1 million. Some of you might be saying, well, this was obviously, Josh, this was, just some guy from the 14th century. Okay, you think it was? You think it was that easy? Go ahead. $1 million. Get your $1 million. Should be simple to recreate, right? But no one can duplicate it. It is unduplicable. Now, our faith does not rest on whether this is the burial shroud of Jesus or not, right? But certainly it is a historical artifact that is extremely interesting. And you know what Acts says? Let me read it to you. In Acts chapter 1, verse 3, I want to make sure I quote it properly. It says, to whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them during 40 days. You know, Jesus wanted to give his church infallible proofs of his resurrection, and he did for his 40 days. What I'm asking you today is this: did he leave one last infallible proof that has become more and more infallible, especially in 1898 and into the 20th and 21st century? Did he leave this infallible proof for a very skeptical age, a very skeptical generation, for you and me who live in the 21st century Western world? I think he did. And what this should ultimately do is give us confidence. Not that we need more confidence, but like this is a historical faith, right? That Jesus is risen. This is a testimony to that he is reigning, that he is alive and well in our hearts. Amen.